Welcome back. You're watching the Global Dialogue. We're in conversation with the outgoing president of the World Bank, David Malpass. Let's address the issue of debt resolution because that is something that you're here to focus on. The good news is that China's at the table. The bad news is that we haven't moved fast enough. What are the next steps that you're focusing on? How confident do you feel in terms of being able to get this done?
The roundtable brings together different parts of the challenge. The private sector, China, as you mentioned, others of the non-Paris Club creditors, and the debtor countries will also be represented, and so that's important because they all have to move somewhat at the same time. And so critical on this is to have a faster timetable for reconciling the debts of the various players. That's been taking a long time within the debt restructuring process. So reconcile the debts, agree that what you're trying to do is have comparable treatment across the various creditors, and then find ways to resolve some of the barriers. I'll give you one example that some of the contracts have penalty interest within them. And so how are you going to handle that if you have a standstill, which has been working for countries? That means stop paying the debt now, work with your creditors in order to get a favorable workout where everyone can find a path forward. But blocking that is the risk that there would be penalty interest, meaning a super high interest rate on the deferred amounts of the debt. So these are detailed issues, but they have to be resolved as the restructuring process comes together. On China, important is they are still including non-disclosure clauses in some of their contracts. That makes it very difficult to do the restructuring. They take collateral, which is not really necessary, and also escrow accounts. So these techniques of the lending techniques, I think, can be improved in a way that really helps reach a conclusion. Importantly in this is China itself can benefit from this. It's one of the biggest exporters, often the biggest to many parts of the world, and so it can benefit if there's faster growth in the countries. It doesn't benefit from having countries become unsustainable. And so I think everyone can work together to try to find a good outcome from this.
You know, given what you said, that it is in China's interest to be able to get to a resolution faster so that we can in fact see growth pick up in some of these debt distressed countries. Now, do you feel confident of being able to get to a conclusion? And more importantly, you have a debt crisis, but you also have, in your words, a giant shortage of capital as far as the developing world is concerned. When the two coincide, what does that mean as far as outlook is concerned?
On your latter point, while the capital is being absorbed by the advanced economies, the amounts that are available are enough to solve this problem. China has done very well with its economy. It's got enough resources to be able to deal with this problem. So that shouldn't, and that's true of the other creditors as well. The private sector creditors are well funded. They're often based in New York, in London, and they can also find ways to absorb change within these debt structures. What we're talking about sometimes is extending the maturities of the debt at a very low interest rate for a long period of time, so it gives breathing room to the creditor, to the debtor country, to actually make the changes needed to grow into the future. So I think there are the elements to make it work. I had a very good meeting in China in December. Kristalina Georgieva, and the IMF director, managing director, and I had a dinner with China Exim Bank and China Development Bank, and we discussed these terms and what steps are needed or that China could be taking in order to facilitate the process. And the premier, Li Keqiang of China, I saw very much the opportunity for China to make more progress. So I'm hopeful that we can put this all together this week in the roundtable.
Well, that's important that you believe that there could be a positive outcome at the end of the meeting here in Bengaluru.
Yes, the elements are there, and we'll have to see how the discussion really goes at the table. You know, it's very important France's role in this because it's the chair of the Paris Club. Under the current circumstances, many of the debtor situations have actually a very small component that is Paris Club, but it has France has been the chair of the various creditor committees. So its role in this and its participation will be important in making it work and begin to get to conclusions for some of the countries.
You know, one of the other issues that's up for discussion at the G20 is the evolution of multilateral development banks like the World Bank. And, you know, the call for reforms has been on for a while now, but both in terms of outreach, in terms of financial capacity, you've been talking about how the bank has evolved. What do you see as the next steps as far as the bank's own evolution are concerned?
There's a huge amount of work done in the World Bank, but I think in the development community as a whole, of how to make the institutions more effective. I welcome that and have embraced that process. And so we're going through each part of the process. What is the mission? How can the mission clearly absorb and take account of the need for global public goods? That's in the climate space, but in other areas as well. That's the reality that countries benefit from what happens in other countries. So how do you encourage that in terms of global public goods, and especially in emission reduction in terms of carbon dioxide? A second phase is, or a second pillar of the exploration going on now, and I should note, it's being led by our board of directors, and they represent the shareholders of the World Bank. The second phase is operations. How do you make them more effective? How do you bring in all of the various tools that can be brought together? And then third is this issue of resources. Can the bank better mobilize its own balance sheet, and then also bring in resources from the rest of the world in order to deal with global challenges? We've made some changes so far already. For example, in December, we presented to the board the benefits that the bank is getting from higher interest rates. It's a little counterintuitive because the clients, the borrowers, are under much pressure, but the bank charges high. The interest rates go up when the world interest rate environment rises, and so that's going to allow us to begin lending, and we've quantified it as $2 billion per year more starting in our next fiscal year. I'll be wrapping up and stepping down at the end of this fiscal year, which is June 30th. But by the next fiscal year, we'll be able to lend $2 billion more per year based on that. And then we're also looking at a change to increase our leverage ratio slightly, and that will allow another $4 billion per year. So these are sizable amounts, but they're not nearly enough for the challenges that the world faces. So we're also looking at all other tools in order to expand our reach, our impact, and the direct amount of financing that we can provide to countries.
You know, you talked about the need for financing or greater financing, especially when we talk about climate financing, etc. What are the mechanisms that you believe one can explore at this point in time? You have previously talked about trust funds as a mechanism that can be explored. What are you seeing as innovative financing mechanisms to address some of these global challenges today?
Some part of the challenge is if I make a loan to you for something that you didn't so much want to do only for yourself, but as part of a global public good, what's the interest rate that can be charged? And can I bring in concessional resources to help you with the decision to take on that loan? That would be an example of that is in the coal transition. As countries look for ways to reduce their dependency on coal, they recognize that it's their cheaper source of financing, but it has this global impact. So how do we blend the financing in? And so we've proposed trust funds to do that. We can also look at ways to bring to more effectively use the callable capital of the World Bank. The board has been discussing techniques that can do that. We've looked at hybrid capital, which is a way to bring in new equity capital. The World Bank has this somewhat unique leveraging capability. We borrow massively in international bond markets. Even this year, year to date, starting in January up through last week, we had already issued $14 billion of bonds, which then directly goes to client countries in our lending. Even our concessional fund, IDA, which is so important for the 75 poorest countries, IDA itself has been successful in issuing bonds in international markets. So these leveraging techniques can be expanded, can be looked at as ways to effectively use global resources. If you look back, the World Bank has this track record from 1944 to present. The entirety of the paid-in capital, the actual cash that's gone into IBRD, it has only been some $20 billion. And from that, the lending of the World Bank became $840 billion. Actually, now it's $860 billion. So from that initial corpus of paid-in capital has come this giant amount of leveraging. So we're looking to use those techniques as broadly and effectively as possible, including for global public goods.
As we look at the world today, and we continue to see some of the challenges that we've already spoken about, high interest rates, inflation, debt, the war in Ukraine continues, no signs of that de-escalating at this point in time. What are you most concerned about, including, of course, a large part of the world moving towards more and more protectionist policies, trade policies?
Well, you mentioned a bunch of concerns. We've been talking about the debt of the poorer countries or of developing countries, but really for the world, one of the giant challenges is the debt of the advanced economies. This is the fiscal deficits that are so large. I need to note, India itself has still a sizable fiscal deficit. It's coming down in the current budget from 9% down somewhat, but it still is large by developing country standards. As we look at the advanced economies, they have just a massive challenge because the national debts are going up at such a rapid rate. So that's a giant challenge. You mentioned trade, and I'm glad you did. Trade is so important to the pace of global growth. It's a vital underpinning of how businesses work and how people can become more efficient through competition across borders. And so I'm worried that the current problems are causing some of the countries to put up new barriers to trade. They get named in different ways. Some of them can be barriers because of security issues, or barriers because of climate issues, or barriers because of food security issues. Some countries are having giant stockpiles of food. All of those become problematic.
Yes, those are some of the problems that we will continue to face. But let me end by asking you, do you feel hopeful that some of the setback that we saw, especially on the development goals and the development agenda, that saw a deterioration, in fact, pre-COVID, and then got further enhanced through the COVID period, do you feel hopeful today that there is courage, political will, political capital to try and address this as you leave office?
I'm comfortable with where the World Bank is on that. We've put this high priority on education and on health. We just launched the new pandemic fund on health, thanks to some donors, and it has the goal of helping countries prepare better for future pandemics. On education, we had a very important conference at the end of 2022 on the techniques that are needed in order to to recover some of the losses that occurred due to COVID. Those techniques are having schools open. That turns out to be one of the most important things. More hours in the having children be in school more hours per day is very important. The funding for schools is important, and also the focus on foundational learning. The actual reading and writing skills were lost during COVID and need to be regained. So I'm comfortable with where the World Bank is on that, but it's amid this giant challenge that the world has with fertilizer. We're worried about the crop cycle for next year, and we have to have as a world this concern that growth in the developing countries is simply not. That's too general. Growth in many of the developing countries is simply not sufficient to really raise living standards. And as you know, young people that don't have jobs have a tendency to either cause trouble in terms of their protests within their own societies, but also moving to other countries. That migration is going to be a focus of. We have a major report coming out on migration as one of the challenges facing the world. So I am concerned about that. I think we all need to redouble and retriple our efforts in terms of development itself, the core principles that we've been working toward.
David Malpass, it's been an absolute pleasure. We wish you the very best of luck as you take on your new challenges, but appreciate you joining us here on the Global Dialogue on CNBC TV18.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Well, with that, it is time for us to wrap up this edition of the Global Dialogue. From all of us here on the team, goodbye and many thanks for watching.